Hello to Berlin and warm welcome to our experts and listeners joining from abroad, especially from Myanmar. I warmly welcome you to our Whitehall expert talk on Myanmar, this time as a joint event from Asienbrücke, the Euro-Asian initiative, together with the Hanns-Seidel Foundation in Myanmar, represented by Achim Munz, who will guide the discussion also. A warm welcome. Today, we gather to explore the complicated landscape of Myanmar, a nation rich in culture, heritage, and natural resources, yet deeply affected by ongoing conflict and political instability. The facts: the country in Asia has a very attractive location with over 50 million people and an equally large area. Since the military coup in February 2021, Myanmar has faced significant disruption, impacting every facet of life and, of course, also including the business environment. The complexities of operating in such an unstable setting present unique challenges and risk for businesses and investors. Our discussion will explore the multi-phase issues that businesses encounter in Myanmar, from navigating and dealing with armed conflict actors to managing economic disruptions and ensuring compliance with international sanctions. It is worth examining the broader implications for investment in the region, considering how these challenges influence investors' confidence and economic growth. By bringing together today's experts, we aim to foster a deeper understanding of the current situation and maybe explore potential pathways for sustainable business practices and investment strategies in Myanmar. For sure, this topic is not the easiest one to talk about. That is why the participation of our experts today is crucial, as we seek to uncover insights and solutions that can contribute to a more stable and prosperous future for the region. And as my last point, to bring our new joiners and listeners up to date, just a few words about the expert talk format. You can always watch past events and other exciting topics in our media library on the Asienbrücke website. We as Asienbrücke always keep an eye on new events happening in Asia. In our next expert talk, for example, we will cover the situation of the free trade agreements in Asia with other interesting experts of the region. Our aim is to keep you updated with exciting insights and content into various regions of Asia and make our community grow bigger. In this sense, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to a thought-provoking and enlightening discussion. Now, Mr. Munz, the floor is yours with our experts. Thank you so much. In Bavaria, it's very hot, and it's hot also in Myanmar, and not only with the temperature. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Scheuer, for the kind introduction. As you have noted, Myanmar is surely not an easy country to discuss at the moment, especially since the 1st of February 2021, which effectively reversed more than a decade's worth of political progress. You also noted the economic impacts have been very severe, and as we can now see, the last 3.5 years, the economy is shrinking annually. There is not only a crisis, but a civil war, especially in the, I would say, in the border parts, most of the border parts of the country, but also, of course, in other ones. There is as you called it, a junta, or as they call themselves, State Administrative Council, SAC, that is controlling a shrinking half of the country, I would say. All the other parts are contested or part of the resistance, which is formed by pro-democracy actors such as the National Unity Government, NUG, or ethnic resistance organizations, EROs. This is where we also see there's a lot of acronyms as well. So I hope a lot of our viewers are, of course, a little bit used to some of the acronyms that we will be using during the next 90 minutes. Maybe I should just highlight a few key developments over the past 12 months in Myanmar. As I've noted before, there is a considerable loss of territory by the SAC, in particular in the border areas to China. There's the so-called 1027 campaign that has caused a lot of conflict, especially in northern Shan, but there's also a lot of, so to say, conflict or territory that has been gained by ethnic armed groups, for example, in Rakhine State with the Arakan Army. Another key development was the conscription, which was introduced by the SAC, which led to a significant amount of young people, of course, leaving the country. There is the economic hardship, the inflation, printing of money that has tripled the currency in the past 3 years. And there's also a continuous extension of a state of emergency by the SAC. All of this, of course, is also impacting the neighbors, but of course also the economic situation of businesses in the country. And this is where I want to come to introduce our speakers. I'm very happy that we have a diverse group of speakers inside and outside of the country. We have Karina Ufert, who is the CEO of the Eurochem, based in Yangon. We also have Alexander Bohush, who is the managing director of Luther Law, also based in Yangon. And we have also Jason Tower, who is the country director of the United States Institute for Peace, based in Thailand. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the different aspects of, as you noted also, Mr. Scheuer, about how can businesses operate responsibly and sustainably. Karina will enlighten us more on this one, how she also deals with the group of companies in the Eurochem. We also will hear more from Alexander Bohush on what does it actually mean when you want to operate a business in Myanmar in terms of the sanction regimes, about banking, what are the challenges there, but also where can be some of the solutions to continue operating businesses that, of course, also support the people of Myanmar in that sense. And lastly, and I think this also is a topic that has not been talked too much, I would say. Jason will be talking about the increase of transnational crime and illicit activities, especially in the border areas, that relate also towards the region, but also are impacting businesses in Europe, in the United States, that all come, so to say, from these syndicates, from these networks that have been increasing in the past 3.5 years along the border. But let me get first to Karina. Karina, I hand over to you for your first presentation. We will have 3 presentations, and afterwards we will have a moderated discussions and, of course, questions and answers from the participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hakim, and thank you very much also, Mr. Scheuer, for the introduction and, of course, for the invitation to join this panel. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about the heated but important topic of, I would say, economic survival, economic functioning in Myanmar. And I'll provide a couple of slides based on the business confidence survey in Yangon. So it gives a bit of a macro level perspective on how European companies operate the environment, what are the challenges, and then perhaps in the Q&A we can dive into the very specific strategies and then ways how the company is adjusting to the environment in the past 4 years, indeed. So it's been quite a lesson learned. Just a couple of words about Eurocham Myanmar. We're an independent business association based in Yangon, Myanmar. We now have 169 members, which are mostly European companies, large European companies. You can see some of them on the slide, but again, the slide represents the membership last year, and we've had some changes. So I wouldn't take it as a reference point in that sense. And we work very closely also, of course, with our stakeholders, whether it's the NGOs, the diplomatic community, and of course the civil society back on the ground in Myanmar, again to inform us on the overall sentiment in terms of the business functioning, and that's why our view as Eurocham Myanmar indeed is that at the moment given, we believe it's impossible to function in line with the responsible business conduct standards, and we work with our members to raise awareness and to train on practices so they can indeed put in place into operations in Myanmar. We have full-time staff in Yangon, so in different types of functions, mostly analytics, and I'll provide a couple of slides indeed to give you some insights on the business sentiments. And of course, we also can, on a regular basis, we produce different briefs and surveys on the situation in Myanmar, and please keep in touch if you want to hear more about the subject. We have close collaboration with the German and Myanmar Chamber of Commerce, which is in some ways functioning under Eurocham Myanmar. Why it's important for us? It's because around a quarter of members of Eurocham Myanmar are German companies. I would say that's also back to Mr. Shaw, you were mentioning. Indeed, I would say there is an imperative to explore a bit more, because there is a significant amount of German companies still remaining in Myanmar, and of course, with the German supply chain law, with all the legislation coming from Brussels in terms of sustainability, it's important for us to find ways on how we can operate in a compliant way, but also convince the stakeholders that indeed what we do in Myanmar brings more positive than negative, and indeed how to mitigate all the risks and the red lines in that sense. Business in Myanmar is a very controversial topic, I would say, because of the several reasons and the perceived notion that the business has some, I would say, beneficial allocations for the regime in that sense. Again, we're very careful in that sense, and that's why indeed the due diligence is a key for us. And I'll speak on the next slide indeed on how we do this in practice. But also we believe that, as I mentioned, the companies, European companies in the compliant sectors can bring more good than harm. And I would say, according to the rough estimates, European companies in Myanmar provide at least, I would say, 400,000 jobs in different sectors. So for Eurocham Myanmar, garments indeed is the largest sector which we represent. So it's, I would say, probably around a quarter of companies indeed would be in the garment sector, whether it's footwear, garments or handbags. But also we have strong presence in the logistics. This is where also the German presence is quite visible, agriculture, health and consumer goods and other sectors. So I would say it's a mixed bag of companies, but I would say it's quite interesting. And again, despite certain articles or headlines which for obvious reasons are there, to put a certain focus on Myanmar, the retention rate is quite strong. So I would say the most of companies are still trying to explore the market. And again, we'll look at the strategies later. And those who left, they left for the obvious reasons, which largely to the sanctions. And Alex will talk about this, but also to some extent with the commercial business case, because indeed, as we will see in the presentation, doing business in Myanmar is not easy. It's quite expensive and complex for a number of reasons. And also a lot of companies are facing reputational issues. And this is where also Eurocham Myanmar is quite active, because we're trying to put a kind of a more nuanced view on what it takes to the business in Myanmar, and indeed how to convince the stakeholders it can be done in a compliant way. And that's a big part of our work, because and we say that due diligence and the heightened due diligence is a must for companies, and it's not a box ticking exercise. It's indeed about understanding your supply chain in the country. It's about having strong relationships with your suppliers, with your customers, and understanding basically the situation around yourself. And how we think it can be done, certainly by relying on the contacts on the ground. And that's why it's absolutely paramount for Eurocham to have presence on the ground, and the same for me, to have I would say say, regular interface, whether it's with the stakeholders, but also visiting the business locations, factories, ports, again, the production units within Yangon or outside Yangon, to indeed have a more in-depth understanding of how the operation actually is, and then also having conversations with people who also involved, let's say, in logistics and banking and agriculture, to get their views to factor in our decision making. We publish daily updates for our members to provide some context information, whether it's about the foreign exchange, the implications of central bank regulations, or any other information. We also conduct capacity building, and as mentioned, stakeholder engagement is key for us, and that expands across the whole continuum of different stakeholders, whether it's trade unions, whether it's manufacturers, or some international institutions. Having said that, we are in full non-engagement with any of the public authorities, and that's been made very clear. You can even find the, I would say, statement on our website. In that sense, we conduct our advocacy through the local counterparts, meaning the Myanmar Chamber of Commerce. Again, we're not hiding in that sense. I would say this webinar is one of the ways for us to indeed explain how we conduct our operations. So transparency is big for us, and that we also encourage our members as much as possible to be open and transparent about the operations, because we believe that they can answer some of the questions which, let's say, some of the activists or any other associations may have. And also, we believe that by operating in Myanmar and adjusting to the environment, it's not only about Myanmar, but it's also about now future-proofing for the environment, the global environment, which is certainly not getting easier, and we see more and more contexts which present a big challenge for companies how to operate from geopolitical and other perspectives. And we believe in that sense that we can work with the stakeholders, including, of course, Asienbrücke and Hanns-Seidel, to provide more specific guidance to the companies on how to operate the context. And having said that, absolutely red lines exist. And of course, we also believe if the situation changes in certain ways, of course, it may mean that we will advise companies to leave the country. But so far, that's not the case. A couple of slides, just very briefly. We conduct business confidence survey on a quarterly basis. We share the questionnaire with our members. I would say the answers here, they largely reflect the perspective of the European investors, of the foreign investors in the country. So you can see, I would say, the past quarter has been the most difficult for the companies, and it's a combination of different factors. Certainly, it's about the deteriorating financial situation, but also the impact of the conscription law. And again, you can see there is a different understanding or perception of how this risk has been factored in across different sectors. And these are the sectors where the EuroCham members operate. I will not go into details. Again, if there are many questions, I'll happy to answer this later on. Now, having said that, while the operation is difficult, I would say for most companies, at least for those which answered the survey and still remain the members of EuroCham Myanmar, the company's been operational, but they've been changing the ways how they engage with the market. So whether they've been moving some of the operations outside the country, or reducing the presence, or moving some of the people, shifting them to the regional offices, particularly in the light of the conscription law, that very much depends. But what you can see, the bottom line is for the companies, they've been largely operational throughout this period. And I would say that was true for the past 3.5 years. Now, if you look more specifically into the challenges, again, no surprise, and I believe all the speakers will talk about this. Certainly, the banking and the foreign exchange challenge is the top one. On the next slide, I will dive a bit deeper on what it means in practice, and then followed quite traditionally, also based on the last experience, on the regulatory challenges, which present a big complex because it does seem that the political apparatus in Myanmar is quite reactive. So it's difficult to talk about the long-term perspective. So most of the regulation which comes in is a very short-term based, reactive to certain issues or instances, and also quite untimely in many cases. Like, for example, the conscription law, which certainly timing-wise, but also lack of communication, sent quite a big shockwave across the whole population. Again, we can talk later about this. Electricity, again, it's no surprise for anyone in Yangon. We still have the rotational power cuts, and certain situation is much more challenging for the I would say for the industrial zones, which receive only a fraction of electricity. But having said that, indeed, somehow companies are coping with this. Again, not to go throughout the whole list, but just to emphasize that indeed, what's interesting for us, we'll always look at number 9, the low demand doesn't seem to be a huge issue for companies. Companies still find Myanmar as an interesting market. But then certainly, of course, you see the whole list of faults and challenges. So it's about fighting on many fronts while still keeping the viable business presence in that sense. And again, just to look a bit more into what I mentioned about the banking challenges is again, there is no surprise for those following Myanmar. There is kind of differentiation what we mean by the exchange rate, especially for the US dollar. We have at least 3 prevailing rates right now, and I believe Alex will talk a bit more on this and the reasons behind this. But again, we can discuss a bit later. But also transferring the money. So yeah, on one hand, of course, we have the whole FATF blacklisting, which is challenging from the due diligence perspective. But I would say there are also internal limitations on the movement of the foreign exchange, which perhaps is as complicating as the external influence on this. Again, and then of course the other factor which perhaps largely to do also with the overall conflict situation in the country is to do with logistics, obviously. So what we can see is that the major border points with Myanmar remain closed, but it's China, Thailand. There is a new opening in Thailand through the Ranong, Kautang border point, but it can only carry a fraction of the goods. And it has, interestingly enough, it has impact on the availability of the foreign exchange rate in the circulation, which then in turn limits the availability of foreign exchange for the importing companies, which are largely our companies. So in that sense, everything is connected. And then, of course, the overall political situation, the conflict has a big impact. But again, we can dive deeper on this later on the Q&A. Companies been adjusting. Again, if you go into the marketplace or any other supermarkets back in Yangon, you can see basically all of this in the slides. And of course, the big I would say hit goes on the regular population who did see the increase in the pricing of the products, reduced availability of the products, which is perhaps less sensitive when you talk about the consumer goods. But then it also of course concerns the medical supplies, the medical diagnostic equipment, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it's unfortunately indeed as always it's the consumer which suffers the most, and this is where we try to work with different stakeholders on explaining the different I would say essential and essentiality sectors to ensure that the essential goods are still being imported to the country despite the restrictions on the foreign exchange transactions. And also, of course, the raw material aspect for the supply disruption for the operations, let's say in the consumer goods sector, is also been disrupted. There's been no, interestingly enough, there's been no impact on the garment sector, so that it's because it's all based on the cut-made pack basis, where you have all the I would say raw materials prepaid offshore, so it does not impact the availability of the foreign exchange in the country. So in that sense, the garment sector has not seen the above mentioned I would say challenges, but there are challenges there as well, obviously. Having said that, for most companies, that's always, it's the most interesting slide for us. And then indeed, we've been conducting this survey since 2021. And interestingly enough, the resilience is there. So for most companies, it's still wait and see mode, and then they're trying to adjust the operation and then kind of hold on into the market, and then to a large extent, of course, because there is a need to sustain the workforce, but there's also an understanding that the market is relatively competitive, and it's important to keep the foot in the door. And of course, there is a hope for some sort of resolution of the situation in that sense. And again, and then we can also see the ways how the company's been adjusting to the situation, but we can again discuss this later on in the Q&A. I wanted to say a couple of words also about the red lines, right? So again, it's not given that the companies will remain there forever, and the patience is running thin for many of these companies. But again, having said that, it's also kind of quantifiable and measurable in terms of so what can push the companies to go away. Something is outside of our control, of course, the safety and security risks. Again, this is about the perception. This is about what needs to happen so the companies leave. Again, certainly the safety security risks for the staff, for the supplies is on every company's mind, and we conduct the regular security briefings for our companies so they can sort of understand the overall environment and how to protect the employees. But certainly, I would say we can bundle it together. Reputational risks and the risk of, let's say, the sanctions or the removal of the trade agreement would be quite detrimental for the companies, given the I would say the nature of the companies that we represent, which are large multinationals, which are quite prone to the reputational risks and any other regulatory challenges in that sense. But also you can see other things, and other things are very much related to the the recent announcement of the I would say the conscription law, which again it's a no surprise law, let's say for any sovereign state, but of course the timing and the rationale is what doesn't sit well with a lot of Myanmar for very right reasons. So indeed, we are tracking the sentiments again because it's of big consequences to our members, and certainly what we've seen in the past half a year is a certain level of resignation from let's say from the employees, blue collar, white collar. It's the same. I'll only put one slide in here. But also, if there is an interest, I can share the full survey. And on the company side, of course, yeah, the companies, and we've been working with the companies. It's part of the due diligence process to raise awareness on how do we deal with this situation, how we can mitigate, let's say, the impact on the employees. Again, there is still an unwritten rule that the people in full employment should not be drafted, or at least they should be able to get a postponement. That's something we are continuously advocating with the local chamber of commerce. We also have some sort of troubleshooting mechanism with them to indeed draw attention in case some of the employees might have been called for service, so we could get them out in the right time. But again, this is about indeed understanding the environment. This would be one of the examples, and then kind of acting upon this in that sense. And indeed, so the impact of the conscription law has been quite significant. But having said that, I would say, yeah, to this point, we've been able to deal with companies and to advise them in the right way how to keep their employees out of harm. Having said that, indeed, a lot of companies decided to relocate some of their staff abroad. Yep, and I would say, given the limitations of time, I would stop here, and then we can always jump into the details in the Q&A. Thank you. Back over.
Karina, thank you so much for your presentation. I think this was a very good start to highlight and see what are the challenges of the businesses. May I hand over to Alexander Bohush? Alex.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation for today's discussion. I will not go into a legal excursus here because I'm sure there's not too many lawyers on the call, but I think I will take this opportunity to indeed address the impact of sanctions, but also the impact of internal restrictions on a lot of financial transactions for businesses active in Myanmar. Because particularly since 2021, restriction on monetary transactions with Myanmar, whether they are caused by outside influences such as international sanctions or the FATF blacklisting, or by regulations of the central bank, have been one of the main obstacles that businesses active in Myanmar are facing, as was shown in Karima's presentation, where banking and financial restrictions was one of the main topics that comes up in every single survey that we are running. So apart from a very quick introduction, I will say a few words about sanctions and the FATF blacklisting, and then go into a little bit more background on what impact that really has for businesses in the country, and particularly for financial transactions and trading with Myanmar as a trading partner. Luther has been in Myanmar since 2012-13. I came in 2013, and I would say we have quite a broad spectrum of clients. We have about 600 clients in the country, more than 600 clients. A lot of them are NGOs, a lot of them are embassies. But then, of course, businesses from pretty much every sector that is active in the country. although we have been a bit less impacted than other law firms since 2021 because we were not very active in the oil and gas and telecom sector, two sectors that were, as Karina mentioned, most hit by the international sanctions because the sanctions and also certain actions of the Myanmar government made it almost impossible for international companies to be active in those sectors within Myanmar. So when we are talking about sanctions, it has to be made clear that Myanmar right now is not subject to any general territorial sanctions. The sanctions that have been implemented for Myanmar, both by the European Union, the United States, United Kingdom, and other countries like Australia, Canada, they are targeting specific individuals and companies in Myanmar. There is an arms embargo, there is a restriction on certain military assistance, but there is not a restriction on generally doing business in Myanmar or with business partners in Myanmar. There are only those restrictions for companies and individuals that have been designated under the specific sanctions regimes. And those restrictions usually comprise travel restrictions and financial restrictions. As I said, I will not go into detail, but the sanctions that have been implemented by the European Union and the US and the UK have a similar approach. Apart from the arms embargo, those sanctions provide that a European citizen is not allowed to make financial resources available to a person that is designated as a sanctioned person or to a company that is controlled and owned by a designated person. The same for the United States, with small differences as to the extent here you're not allowed to work with a company that is sanctioned or a person that is sanctioned or a company that is owned by a sanctioned person or company. But again, the scope is very similar of all the sanctions. And we had several rounds of sanctions from both from the European Union, US, and the UK, with the first round happening already in 2017 after the Rohingya crisis in Rakhine State. But then, of course, with more and more rounds of new sanctions since February 2021, pretty much every year we have 2, 3, or 4 rounds where new people or new companies will be sanctioned. A lot of that is driven by further information when it becomes available or to target specific industries. For example, at the moment, one of the key concerns that is being brought up again and again is companies that are providing jet fuel to Myanmar, because naturally that jet fuel is also used by the military air force to run fighter jets that are bombing civilians and that are fighting actively in the country. So different rounds of sanctions are targeting different people and different entities, but the outcome is pretty much the same. And for most European companies, or most European investments, the international sanctions probably don't have a direct impact because it is very unlikely that a European business would indeed engage with a sanctioned person, or at least it is very possible for any European company to do due diligence to make sure that they are not engaging with a company that is sanctioned by the US or by the European Union. If a company would be engaging with a sanctioned entity, that of course has quite considerable consequences. Naturally, if the sanction regimes applies to you under law, so if you're a European citizen or a European company and you are violating European sanctions, then you may be subject to fines or even imprisonment under the respective national laws. Apart from that, companies that are active in Myanmar always have to consider the risk of an indirect sanction, meaning even if you are not subject, for example, to compliance with US sanctions, activities that would fall under the US sanctions may cause the company itself being sanctioned by the United States. We have seen this in a few cases where, for example, Chinese companies got sanctioned by the United States because of their cooperation with Myanmar sanctioned parties. And on top of that, of course, every company that engages in Myanmar would have to make sure that it doesn't have any contractual obligations to comply with a sanctions regime, even if it is not applicable by law. For example, if you have committed to a financial institution or to a donor that you will comply with US sanctions, then contractually you would be bound to comply with those sanctions in the country, even if you're a European company. Now, probably the bigger issue or the bigger risk for, no, the bigger impact on business in Myanmar doesn't come from the actual sanctions that have been implemented, but comes from sanction-like initiatives that we are looking at. So those are not formal sanctions enacted by a government, but we are mostly talking about non-binding initiatives or recommendations. One of the continuous threats to Myanmar is always whether the Everything But Arms initiative of the European Union may get cancelled. And EBA is of a very high importance to Myanmar because it allows the duty-free import of Myanmar exports into the European Union. And in a country which is driven by a low-cost labor sector, so particularly the garment sector, and then the export of agricultural goods, losing this access to the European market would, of course, have a tremendous impact. It's a big risk. It's something that always has to be considered. And it has to be considered because it directly impacts the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of low-income workers in the country without really affecting the military government to the extent that someone would like. A similar risk probably comes from the current ILO Commission of Inquiry for Myanmar, which was implemented after there were questions about the possibility to organize in labor unions in Myanmar. Again, the ILO would not be in a position to give binding instructions to companies to exit the market, but then if the ILO would give a recommendation or a statement that it is not possible to carry out responsible business in Myanmar, that certainly would cause multinational companies to consider whether it is still possible to be active in the market or not. Again, particularly, of course, the garment sector, which is an employer of thousands of people. And finally, and that one probably had the biggest impact of all these sanction-like activities since 2021, we have the blacklisting by the Financial Action Task Force. Myanmar is not new to being blacklisted. Myanmar was blacklisted before. It was put on the gray list from 2016, or in 2016, it was then removed from the gray list. 2020, it was put back on the gray list, and finally in 2022, Myanmar was added back to the blacklist. The consequence of that is a recommendation of the Financial Action Task Force to the participating jurisdictions and their financial institutions to implement enhanced due diligence requirements for any transactions to and from Myanmar. In practice, we had a lot of those enhanced due diligence requirements already after Myanmar was put on the blacklist, and then particularly after the events of February 2021. And initially, there was a hope that the FATF blacklisting would not cause an immediate worsening of the situation in Myanmar, particularly because there is a recommendation included that the transfer of funds to and from Myanmar, particularly for non-profit activities, should continue to be possible. In practice, it's unfortunately not quite the case. A lot of international banks have stopped correspondence relationships with Myanmar. They have ceased correspondence activities. They have ceased all transactions with Myanmar. And the biggest impact probably had the stop of financial transactions from Singapore, and particularly United Overseas Bank, which was one of the largest, or which was probably the international bank carrying out most financial transactions to and from Myanmar. But further, also, most of the USD clearing agents have stopped clearing of USD transactions from and to Myanmar, making it almost impossible to transfer USD to or from the country. There are certain consequences of that. One of the consequences is a natural one. Companies are moving to regional country partners, Thailand and China becoming more and more important, and transactions are carried out more and more through Thai baht and Chinese yuan. But unfortunately, another consequence of not being able to use the formal banking system is that a lot of transactions in Myanmar are being pushed back into informal financial services, which in Myanmar are referred to as hundi services, and which always existed in the country, particularly before 2010 and 2012, which are now coming back. The problem with that is that one of the main concerns of the Financial Action Task Force, and one of the main reasons why Myanmar was put on the blacklist, is exactly that, the use of informal financial service providers to facilitate cross-border payments. So now we are getting into a situation where Myanmar is blacklisted for using hundis, but the blacklisting results in more and more companies or more and more transactions being carried out through the hundi services. What does it mean for Myanmar and for doing business in Myanmar? In 2022, the Myanmar Central Bank reacted to the lack of foreign direct investments and a lack of remittances of export earnings into the country. It became very obvious that Myanmar would sooner or later run out of foreign currency reserves, and in an attempt to stabilize the local currency or to control the outflow of foreign currency, the central bank took certain actions. I'm not going to go through it in detail because you can all look at the slides if they are put on the website. But essentially, since April 2022, after first converting most of the foreign currency reserves in the country, the central bank implemented strict restrictions on mandatory conversion of foreign exchange, as well as approval requirements to transfer money from Myanmar to overseas recipients. So the main goal here is to limit the outflow of funds from Myanmar. And that, of course, impacts every single business operating in the country. If you have to import goods from overseas, you have to make payments to overseas. If you are engaging service providers overseas, let's say Google or Facebook for advertisement, you have to make payments to Google or Facebook outside of Myanmar. If you want to pay dividends to shareholders outside of the country, you need to transfer funds. So this restriction on making payments to overseas has a very large impact on any business operating in the country as it stands today. And it has a second implication, and that is the deterioration of the foreign currency rates. So here you have an overview. Before 2021, the US dollar was worth approximately 1,200 Myanmar chats. It was at that time at what I would call a controlled free float. There was not too much intervention by the central bank. And then after January 2023, the central bank reacted to the depreciation of the chat against the dollar by implementing a reference rate that now is 2,100. There's a typo. I will correct that. The reference rate until today is 2,100 chat for 1 USD. That is the official rate at which, if a Myanmar company is receiving dollars from overseas, the dollars would be credited in chat to the bank account of the Myanmar company. That is also the official rate that if our company would exchange dollars on our bank account into Myanmar chat, our dollars would be exchanged by the bank. Now, the unofficial market rates, meaning the rate that you will get if you are selling your US dollars at the money changer, were last month at approximately 6,500 for the dollar. so 3 times more than the official reference rate. And this is causing a lot of issues because we have a combination where the outflow of funds and the import of goods are directly linked, and where the government is trying to control the inflation, particularly for the household essential goods, that is, for imported goods, primarily cooking oil, petroleum, and then rice within the country. The only way that the government currently sees to control the prices of those essential household goods is by prescribing maximum prices. So if you are selling rice, if you are selling cooking oil within the country, as a trading business, you are required to follow certain prescribed prices at which you are able to sell the cooking oil to consumers. At the same time, if you want to purchase cooking oil from overseas because production within the country is very low, your import in dollars probably has to be valued somewhere between the unofficial market rate and the trading platform rate, which is shown on the right side, because it is not possible to purchase USD simply at the bank. It is not possible to simply exchange Myanmar Chat into dollars. Subject to prior approval by the authorities, any company that wants to purchase dollars has to purchase them on a trading platform. The official rate at the trading platform is 3,400. The unofficial rate, meaning the payments that are happening in the background, are probably 5,000 Chat per dollar. Meaning the actual cost at which an importer is importing goods into the country is more than double of the reference rate that is being implemented by the central bank. Results in a lot of accounting issues for businesses that are operating here, results in inflation of any goods that have an imported part or an imported cost, but then also results in difficulties for those essential household goods that the government is trying to keep artificially low. I will skip over those. I will just give you a last short explanation of what it now means. As I mentioned, everyone that wants to make a payment to overseas has to apply to the authorities to get approval to make those payments to overseas. There are different processes for imports, for service fee payments, etc. And to be very frank, certain payments are currently not possible. A company trying to pay dividends to overseas will right now not get any approval from the government. But even for imports, which used to be the easiest way to make payment to overseas, the government has implemented a lot of new restrictions. Most notably, any import of goods into the country. So every single shipment requires an import license, and that applies for almost all different kinds of goods. Now, what the government is doing, again, in the attempt to control how much money is leaving the country and what the trade balance of Myanmar shows, is not only to restrict payments to overseas, but is also to restrict the imports of goods into the country. And any company that tries to import goods when they are applying for an import license, every such application will be scrutinized. There are certain priority areas: agricultural goods, pharmaceutical goods, raw materials. There are other goods that cannot be imported right now at all, luxury items and personal vehicles. But on top of that, every application for an import license will be scrutinized based on the payment mode, meaning how will the importer make payment for the goods that are being imported? And here, again, we are coming back to the biggest concern that we are having with doing business right now. Even if a company has access to foreign exchange, like, meaning they have US dollars on the bank account or they have Chinese yuan on the bank account, the government may not approve the import license because they want to stabilize their foreign exchange reserves and they want to stop as much of the outflows of foreign exchange from Myanmar as possible. And the general consequence of that is, again, that more and more companies are transacting through illegal means, meaning they will work with informal financial service providers, with fundis, who will arrange for payments outside of the country and accept repayment within the country in Myanmar, Chad. Again, doing exactly what the Financial Action Task Force has blacklisted Myanmar for, and further increasing illegal trade of goods and illegal financial services from Myanmar to parties outside of the country. And since most of those illegal imports are also happening in the border areas, I think that's actually a good chance to hand over to Jason so that he can come to the real illegal activities.
Thank you, Alex. That was very, very detailed as well. And thank you very much for enlightening us. There would have been actually right away my questions as well on the exchange rates and on the payments. But first, Jason, please start with your presentation.
Thanks, Akim, and thanks for the invitation to be a part of this panel. I'll be shifting gears somewhat significantly, talking less about the regulatory environment and talking about an aspect, a very dark aspect of the economy that has actually grown in an extraordinary way, in a very concerning way, since the February 2021 military coup, that being the illicit economy. Before kind of jumping into some of the details, particularly around what's happening with fraud and scams and some of the trends that we're seeing around growing global security threats emanating from Myanmar as a result of all of this criminal activity, just wanted to very briefly introduce the United States Institute of Peace. USIP was established by the US government in 1984 as an independent, nonpartisan institute that works internationally on the prevention and mitigation of violent conflict. We work on peace and security issues around the world. While USIP was founded by and is funded by the US government, I want to stress that I am an independent expert working on Myanmar issues, and that what I'm sharing here today does not reflect necessarily views or viewpoints of the US government. I also wanted to say that USIP has been involved in looking at really issues around the nexus of illicit economies and transnational crime and conflict for quite a few years now. So much of what I'll be speaking to, it comes from some of the research we've done both before and after the coup around transnational crime and around illicit economies and how they impact conflict and security issues in the country and beyond, for that matter. I have a few visuals that I'll toss up, but I guess really kind of jumping in, the big picture around illicit economies is that it's been a space of unparalleled growth since the coup. According to UNODC, you saw a 38% in the increase in opium production in 2023, and that's a trend that is continuing. So Myanmar now represents the #1 market in the world for opiates trade, as well as for a range of other narcotics. Of course, we talked a little bit about the blacklisting. Challenges around money laundering continue to be immense. But I think the other major crime set that you've seen in Myanmar really grow in an extraordinary way since the coup is that of forced labor scamming, which has become one of the largest economic activities in Myanmar at this point. And just to show you here, this is drawn from a recent USIP Senior Study Group report that looks at the phenomenon of pig butchering and forced labor scamming by some of the PRC scam syndicates that are behind this particular form of criminality. You can see here that Myanmar is #1 in the world in forced labor scamming. The estimated value of sophisticated forced labor scams being perpetrated from inside Myanmar is in the range of 15.3 billion US dollars per year. And so benchmarking that against the country's GDP, that's roughly 23% of the value of the country's GDP, which shows you really just how significant of an illicit market this has become. Backing up very quickly, and I don't want to, for sake of time, to go into too much detail, but I think it is important just to talk very briefly about what this type of crime is, pig butchering, because it is happening on a very large scale from within Myanmar, and it's now impacting people all around the world. Basically, what pig butchering is it's a form of long con. It's a form of sophisticated scam that involves a perpetrator building an online relationship with a victim, building trust with that victim, often through a romance scam or through building a close romantic relationship with the individual, and then introducing what appears to be a legitimate, often cryptocurrency trading platform to that individual, make the individual think that they're making a lot of income and profit on that particular platform. And then once you reach a point where the victim more or less has placed all of their worldly possessions and assets into that platform, the process of fattening up the pig is complete, and the perpetrator goes in to slaughter the victim, which is why we use the very crude type of description of this particular crime, pig butchering. It's a form of criminality where the perpetrator establishes psychological control over the victim, gets them to put all of their worldly assets into one of these fraudulent investment platforms, and then steals everything, leaving that victim really, I think, harmed on two levels: the emotional, psychological level, and we are seeing increased suicide rates among victims, but then also, the monetary losses, which are enormous. The twist on all of this, though, is that often the individuals that are doing this scamming are also victims. So in Myanmar, and you can see some of this from these graphics here, in Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, which are the three epicenters of this form of scamming, you have now people from 66 different countries around the world that have been trafficked into scam centers to work as forced laborers, scamming people from all across the globe. So this form of scamming has now hit well over 100 countries around the world. And what this graphic shows you is all of the countries that have been impacted in one way or another by this form of criminal activity. It's estimated that roughly 64 billion US dollars is being stolen by the criminal actors that are behind these scams. Again, the vast majority of these funds, roughly 43 billion, is attributed to criminal activity taking place in Myanmar, Laos, and in Cambodia. So this is really a global crisis, both of human trafficking. You're seeing new forms of trafficking where the criminals are using digital platforms, social media platforms, to traffic individuals by offering them what appear to be lucrative jobs in what might promise to be a lush office environment. Instead, they're trafficked through Thailand, they're trafficked sometimes through Dubai, sometimes through other countries, into the Myanmar-Thailand borderlands, where they're forced under the control of the Myanmar military's border guard force, along with the Chinese crime groups that it's partnered with, as well as with other significant militia groups. Some of the big players involved include the United Wa State Army, the Democratic Karen Benevolent Army. Increasingly, the Shan State's Progressive Party is also becoming involved in this criminal activity. And then also the NDAA, the National Democratic Alliance Army up in Mongla. So you see there's a range of different actors, but the most significant of the actors involved in this is by far the Myanmar military. Of course, all of this criminal activity in Myanmar has had a pretty significant impact also on the trajectory of the conflict. You've seen where there's been some major military operations, and I know there's been some references already to Operation 1027, but Operation 1027 was predicated around a failure of the Myanmar military to crack down on transnational crime and to crack down on all the scamming taking place up in the Kokong area, where the Myanmar military's border guard force was one of the key players operating scam syndicates, targeting Chinese nationals, both with human trafficking into the scam syndicates, but also scamming billions of dollars from the Chinese-speaking world using the same form of methodology that I just discussed. Operation 1027, initiated around 3 ethnic armed organizations, the Brotherhood Alliance, eradicating that territory of both scam syndicates, but then more importantly, eradicating that area of the Myanmar military. And I think it is significant that that single move in Operation 1027 has been one of the most, I would say, impressive disruptions of this very nasty industry since the military coup. Of course, unfortunately, while in the range of 50,000 people have now been sent back to China, many of these being victims of human trafficking. Unfortunately, many of them are not getting treated as victims of human trafficking once being sent back into China. But that's kind of another story that we could talk about in terms of the human rights challenges that are there around forced labor scamming. But the key point is that this has not really led to a major disruption, but what it's led to is more of a shift around the country in the location of a lot of these scam zones. The map that I show here gives you kind of an idea of where you have large scale or industrial scale online scam operations now taking place. I think what's significant is that since Operation 1027, you've seen that many of these operators have shifted into central Shan State. So you now have quite large online scam operations that are in places like Tanyang. They've also been discovered around Wanhai. You continue to have a lot of them around Tachile and in the Thai Myanmar border area. And then also Myawaddy has become really the main hub for them under the Myanmar military's border guard force on that border, which continues to be one of the most malign actors involved in drawing more of these criminal groups into the country. You've also seen recently that all the way down at 3 Pagodas Pass, so that's quite distant actually from the cluster here in Myawaddy. You can see it's the furthest south point on the map here. There's a recent growth of scam syndicates in this area. Maybe just a few trends that we're seeing in terms of the scam operations since 1027 was initiated. I'll mention a few of these things. One is, of course, I've already talked about the shift in locations. Secondly, is you're seeing a lot of new players getting involved. So in addition to the Myanmar military's border guard force, you're seeing where, similar to drugs, the SSPP is becoming more of a player here, while the WA, over the past couple of decades have moved drugs from the northern part of the border down to the center of Shan State and down to the Thai border. You're seeing that same pattern now follow with online forced labor scamming. You're also seeing much more of the DKBA getting involved in this, and that's where I think it's particularly concerning that the DKBA compounds, which are to the south of Myawaddy, are some of the most notorious in terms of the human rights abuses and torture that is used to get people to scam inside of those particular zones. We're also seeing new patterns in the victims. So since forced conscription has hit, you're now seeing that in Shui Koko, for example, there's a lot of scam syndicates that are trying to basically only bring in Myanmar laborers. Some of the Myanmar laborers report going in willingly, although it's important to note that once they're in the scam centers, they no longer have the freedom to leave so easily. Many have their passports confiscated, and should they decide to stop scamming, they could easily be sold to other operators, either nearby or further afield. So you've seen where forced conscription has really impacted this. The other key trend, though, is an increasing trend away from targeting Chinese nationals towards targeting the rest of the world. And scam syndicates have been identified that are targeting nationals in different European countries, as well as in the United States, which is something that I think is important to be aware of. Some of these scam centers, although not on an industrial scale and not necessarily using forced labor, have also been found in cities like Mandalay, cities like Yangon and Naypyidaw. And I think another pattern we found is that wherever you have large real estate projects that are distressed, you tend to also get some of this phenomenon of the scam syndicates moving in and trying to perpetrate online scams from within some of these distressed projects. So that's another challenge that we're seeing. And then lastly, there's been a major crackdown that's been undertaken in the Lao Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone, which is another area that hosts a lot of this activity. You've seen the militia groups in northern Myanmar who had a lot of their personnel based inside of the Golden Triangle have now started to call those personnel back. And you're seeing where a lot of the Myanmar scammers and scam syndicates, roughly 1/3 of the population of that special economic zone, which is really predicated on supporting criminal activity. Many of them are now moving back to Myanmar, moving particularly again into the Myawaddy area or into the center of Shan State. Lastly, to mention, whereas last year and really leading up to the middle of this year, you saw a lot of pressure from China on the military regime to crack down on crime and to crack down on these scams. That has really, I think, started to dissipate quite a bit. So while China is still messaging the importance of cracking down on scams, it's also now showering legitimacy on the regime, even publicly trying to lift up the regime around cracking down on scams. And you'll see from this graphic here that the Chinese police actually gave an award to Yarpie for his role in making contributions to policing in China, dealing with online scams, although really the Myanmar military is one of the big beneficiaries of this activity and not part of the solution. So, you know, this phenomenon of online scamming continues to be a major problem across the country. It's really, I think, something that businesses should also be aware of, particularly if you're involved in, cross-border activities, for example, between Thailand and Myanmar, knowing that a lot of these scam syndicates are operating in those areas. Many of them try to pose as legitimate businesses. And of course, laundering $15 billion per year is not an easy task. So many of them are moving funds into real estate. Many of them are moving funds into different forms of nightclubs, entertainment businesses, restaurants, things like that. So that may be also something to look out for. You also see where traditionally there's been a lot of overlap between some of the key crony companies that have close ties to the Myanmar military and these scam syndicates. So in particular, up in Koh Kong, some of the major players, for example, the Fully Light company, which was involved in scamming up there, it actually had businesses all across the country. And many of those businesses continue in Yangon, in Myawaddy, in Mandalay, and even down in Rakhine State. So in terms of due diligence, looking at business partners and their potential involvement in criminal activity is also something that is significant. I want to say something quickly on social media, because this is another major problem. Most of the scams take place over social media, whether that be fraudulent labor scams or the fraud, the pig butchering scams. But social media is rampant with this, and it's happening really in many different languages. So, you're seeing where a lot of Myanmar nationals are getting hit now by scams, or Myanmar speakers are getting hit by scams because a lot of people are desperate to get money out of the country, or they're desperate for income generating activities. And so they're an easier and easier target for scammers. Of course, scammers are targeting people with some means and with some interest in things like cryptocurrencies, which have become, I think, increasingly popular in Myanmar. That, again, makes people in Myanmar more susceptible to some of this. So these are perhaps some of the things to consider. I mean, I could go into much more detail on, kind of the global connections or the involvement of the PRC in this, or what law enforcement is trying to do in terms of rescuing people. You now have thousands upon thousands of victims from all across the world that are sitting in very unfortunate circumstances inside of these scam centers in the Myanmar borderland with Thailand. And it's really almost impossible to extract a lot of these people. You have instances of large payments of ransoms to get people out. And then the patterns in terms of how people are trafficked continue to change and become more sophisticated. So if it's of interest, happy to go into more of those dynamics, as well as how this is situated within the broader context of the economy and the conflict in the Q&A. Thank you.
Jason, thank you so much for your detailed presentation of what's going on along the border lines. Now we have the next 15 minutes or 18 minutes for questions and answers. So please feel free to pitch any questions to any of the speakers. I will start with some of the questions. Jason, how do you see that this illicit activity, how does it directly impact, for example, to Europe or to European companies? What do you see there of a relationship? Just to understand this better, I know one thing I know is we had this in the Bavarian Parliament. Was a few months ago a discussion because exactly this pig butchering happened with a few $1,000 to German victims. So is there any other examples that you can note what happened there, or what is happening there?
I mean, I know the US better because that's where I've done a lot of my own research on this. And we're in the range of around $5 billion of known losses to these scams, with one individual in the US. I think the largest known victim lost $50 million to this. What's interesting about that case, and which is something that, maybe companies and even financial institutions should be aware of, is that the criminal actors had more or less fully manipulated this individual psychologically. So he was even willing to make some very serious breaches. He worked for a bank as the executive of that bank. He's now on trial for his crimes. But basically, he breached some of the bank's internal controls, and he effectively borrowed illegally a very large sum of money from that bank, which resulted in the bank ultimately collapsing. So that's one very concerning case. I know, though, from DW, Deutsche Welle Media, though, that the number of cases of pig butchering targeting Europeans and leading to, individuals losing their retirement funds or losing hundreds of thousands of dollars or more, these are increasing at a very alarming rate. Particularly also in French-speaking countries, because they're bringing in a lot of labor from many different French-speaking countries around the world, which means that, because of the access to scammers who have that language skill set, they're able to then target people from that particular country setting. I think any speaker of English, though, is going to be subject to this, though, because, the scam syndicates are increasingly, through these different data breaches, getting access to some personal details about people. They have a sense before they actually target someone of that person's net worth, of some of their vulnerabilities, single, not single, in a happy marriage, not in a happy marriage. I mean, some of these sorts of things I think they're already aware of when they reach out and make that first contact. So, they're actually hitting people with a pretty high success rate, which is quite disturbing. And then I think also there's a lot of implications for example, recruitment companies in Europe, because you do see where there are a lot of these advertisements being placed on the websites of these recruitment companies that are global, right? But some of them are European companies, and then they have some complicity in this. And then, of course, any social media company, and of course here you see where there's a pretty big and bold move on the part of the French government in terms of arresting the CEO of Telegram. But this is perhaps where there's another implication also for Europe is the social media element of this and the fact that these platforms are being used. And I think what the courts in France are saying is that basically Telegram provided a platform for criminals. And then that's what the courts are basically looking at in this case, targeting the CEO of Telegram. From my own research on Telegram, I can tell you that it's rampant with public groups that are basically set up to facilitate money laundering, facilitate the actual sales of cyber slaves, and to facilitate illicit businesses. It's kind of serving as a marketplace for a lot of these illicit actors.
Thank you for that, Jason. It is quite scary to hear all of these sorts of things. A bit different topic. Alex talked quite a bit about the inflation and an exchange rate. And Karina, my question to you would be, how do businesses cope with salaries in Myanmar? How can you know what I mean? If the inflation goes up like that, you of course need to adapt salaries as well. And what's the regime there by the different companies, how to cope with this?
Thank you, Akim. That's a very good question because that's something on the mind of our HR working group as well, because we realized that most of the global consulting companies like Mercer and so on, they don't have or don't wish to have access to the actual data which reflects, let's say, the reality on the ground, but also the inflation figures are often based on the official data, which again don't represent a very accurate representation of what's happening in the country. So from our side, again, the idea was to bring in the HR professionals together and to see how we can share the practices. So again, there are certain established practices among the multinational companies is to the salary review at least on the I would say every 6 months, and then to look into the available data from multiple sources to really have a better sense. From Eurocham side, we are starting our own CPI index measurement based on the market data and information. So we're hiring a consulting agency to actually do this, because again, we realized that for companies, it became almost impossible to actually indexate the salaries in that sense. But certainly there is a whole variety of practices. Indeed, as I mentioned, the salary review takes place at least every 6 months. And also, the companies are very mindful about any additional services for the people. I would say transportation became quite a must for many, especially for those operating in the industrial zones. Any specific allowances also related, let's say, to the healthcare. What we saw was quite interesting in the garment sector, and again, back to the point that we indeed have the whole variety of the formal business, informal business, and the scam centers and so on. But I would say the big benefit of the formal employment and the formal business, and back to the point what Alex was raising about the potential threat to the garments, a lot of garment companies would, for example, procure items in bulk, whether it's rice, whether it's oil, medicine, and so on, and in that sense also push the prices down for the workers, for the employees. So again, I would say it's a mix of measures, but we have to rely on the local knowledge because unfortunately the external information sources are not fully reliable in that sense. Thanks.
Can I just follow on from that? How do you define responsible investments these days? Like, you know what I mean? I'm aware the people in Myanmar, of course, they need healthcare products. They need, you know what I mean, anything that has to deal with the health, but also, of course, food. And how do you define this for your clients? You know what I mean? That you can work there, yeah, and you know what I mean? How do you support this as well?
Yeah, thanks for this. I mean, there is no business as usual in Myanmar, and we're very clear to our members as well. And then I would say, in that sense, again, for companies, it's about the awareness raising. And I would say those companies with operations in the ground, they're perhaps a bit more aware of the context. And then also, since seeing the employees on a day-to-day basis, the kind of creativity kicks in. So they're trying to really look into how can I do more than the bare minimum to support the people? And I would say, indeed, the criticism even to the Mercer data is, I would say, one of the biggest example, because we can have certain global practices. And I would say most of our members, unfortunately, the subject to all of this compliance and the global practices, which let's say, oh, you can only do the salary indexation, let's say once a year, it has to be based on certain targets. But we say, look, our situation is very different. So on one hand is raising awareness of this, and in daily updates, for example, we constantly publish, whenever it comes to, let's say, the foreign exchange fluctuations, when it comes to the, I would say the inflation rates or the cost of products going through the roof, and also sharing those practices among the members. So if we see that certain companies ended up putting in place something which makes sense, like I would say, buying products in bulk, or let's say securing more preferential access, whether it's medical supplies or something else, we try to share it within the community so the other companies can follow this as well. And of course, due diligence, that's an absolute must. And indeed, we heard a lot about the risks, and that's something we want companies to be aware, because that's the environment we operate, but we also inform them about strategies, how to contract in the best way possible. Thanks.
And following from that a bit, I saw this also on your presentation in terms of safety and security. How, you know what I mean? How do you communicate safety and security? Yeah. I know you mentioned the briefings, but you know what I mean? You live in Yangon, and Alex, you as well. How do you perceive your own safety in that instance?
Well, I would say, from personal perspective, and again, I'm very conscious that I'm a foreigner, and at this point in time, foreign is not target. That's I would say that's kind of a general understanding. Of course, there is a notion of wrong time, wrong place, but I would say the underlying thing from a personal perspective is, I would say at this point there is a reasonable sense of, I would say, reasonable safety in terms of the pure physical safety. Of course, there can be other issues related to, let's say, the freedom of expression in certain cases, which we're all mindful for. But having said that, I would say Eurocham Myanmar has been quite open in our positions, and we've been putting a lot of information online, including the garment sector fact sheet, which also, I would say, outlines quite openly links to the military between the certain industrial zones and so on. So I would say it's a balancing act. Now, when it comes to the companies, I would say again, I mean, there are certain, I'd say most of our members are large multinationals, so they will have their safety protocols in place. Of course, from our side, it's information, it's explaining the context as much as possible. It's linking to the security companies, which can provide the heat maps. It's about some common sense information, again, whether, who is a reasonable target and who is not, at least based on our expertise. But everything else, most operations would be based on their own operational protocols, especially for logistic companies, which are more exposed to the areas of conflict. But for the majority of companies, the areas are in Yangon, around Yangon, so that's not really the case for the time being.
Yeah, thank you. Alex, just maybe also another question to you in terms of what Jason said before. You deal with a few hundred of clients. What's your perspective on these illicit activities that are going on there? Is there any effects that you see also with your clients, with the companies in the country?
I don't think that we see much more of particularly the scam center activities that Jason has highlighted. Those have been going on as long as I worked as a lawyer. I can remember companies making wrong transfers of money because they fell for wrong emails. So I don't see a direct impact of the scam centers as such. Although looking around in Yangon, what you can certainly see is what Jason mentioned when it comes to the money laundering, whether it's property purchases around the city, or indeed investments around the city, where you always have to ask, where do the funds come from? And that's also nothing new. It's always been the case. If someone has a lot of money in Myanmar, that you should ask where they are getting the money from. Much more impacting our clients is indeed the less criminal but still illegal border trade and everything that is related to it, when it comes to imports that are happening without licenses, when it comes to imports over the river without proper cooling for pharmaceuticals, which can have an impact on people, and then you don't have proper product liability because there is no legal importer of those pharmaceuticals. And then, of course, the entire money laundering issue, funds being transferred in and out of the country through the Hundi system. So most of what we are seeing, and that is impacting our clients because they rely on the raw materials and they rely on the ability to make payments to overseas, are linked to those. And of course, you cannot rule out that this puts the client directly in contact with the camp centers or with other criminal organizations, because those often are the ones that have dollars outside of the country, but need shut within the country to finance their operations in the country. So due diligence of who you are working with in those structures is definitely very important. And
Good.
when we are talking about Hundis, we are talking about companies that can shift millions of dollars in a day. So any person that can shift millions of dollars in a day, you want to ask, where does that money come from?
And final question, Alex, there is, how do you see any impact if, let's say, a company works in Thailand or works in the Philippines or in Vietnam? Would there be any impacts from the Myanmar situation, from the Myanmar business situation, also on these companies? Because, of course, some of the regional companies in Thailand or in Vietnam, of course, also have business relationships with companies in Myanmar.
Yeah, I mean, it depends all the cross-border trade. It also affects all Myanmar businesses that are relocating their activities, particularly to Thailand as the neighboring country, whether that's on the profit or on the not-for-profit side. A lot of businesses have relocated activities to Thailand, whether they have an operation there or not. To what extent that is legal to operate in Thailand for them is a different story then. But what we are seeing, it's a bit of a red tail, right? If suddenly all the transactions are booked in Thailand, even though the business is carried out in Myanmar, technically that may then be tax evasion on the Myanmar side because you're not paying tax anymore on the incomes generated in the country. So we have a lot of clients that want to move operations out of the country, that want to move their Myanmar employees to a different country to work there. And then we have to explain, is it legally possible and what is required for them to do so? And if not, then in a lot of cases, they still do it. So there's certainly, there is some work for the lawyers here.
Good. Thank you very much to all three of you for your presentations. For the last words, I'll hand over to the chairman of the Asienbrücke.
Thank you, Achim. A big thank you to our experts, Karina, Jason, Alexander, and thank you for our good cooperation between Hanns-Seidel Foundation and the Asienbrücke. Thank you, Achim. Thanks for keeping this talk honest. I learned a lot about scammers, for example. As said, this expert talk today was for sure not the easiest one, and I really appreciate the effort in making it easy to understand while keeping it real. Thank you so much. Asienbrücke is very flexible. I had to change my position a little bit because to charge my iPad, but we are flexible in all our topics. And to our listeners, thank you for taking the time. This talk will be live in a few days on our webpage, but you can also watch past events on other exciting topics in our media library at the Asienbrücke website. In our next expert talk, we will cover the situation of the free trade agreements in Asia with other interesting experts of the region, and we will be happy if you would join too. Thank you so much in this sense.